Afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Each Saturday afternoon at this time, the National Broadcasting Company brings you the War Telescope from London. You will hear NBC's observer in the British capital, John McVeigh, in an interesting discussion of developments of the war. So now to London to see what Mr. McVeigh has in store for us. Come in, John McVeigh in London.
This is John McVeigh in London. As the hour and the day of invasion come closer, signs of increased tension are becoming more visible in Britain. The people are living on two planes. One is the round of daily work. On that plane, nerves become irritated more quickly than usual. People do their jobs, work hard at them, but always with a feeling that everything from now on will be a kind of marking time until the day when the assault begins. You might compare it to what a boxer does with his time on the day of a championship fight. He's done his training. Nothing will be really important now until he jumps from his chair under the arc lights when the bell sounds for the first round. Meanwhile, he must spend the day going through the motions of eating, sleeping, and diverting himself. But always he knows that life will again seem important to him only when the seconds step out of the ring and he stands facing his opponent with his whole future at stake. For the people of Britain, life on the second plane consists of looking forward to the coming operations, wondering about them, speculating, hoping, confident that when the attack begins, daily life will again take on significance and meaning. I think it's partly from this feeling of suspended existence that it's been responsible for the wave of strikes in Britain. Bus drivers and conductresses in London declare their jangled nerves can't stand more trips per day on the summer schedule, so they strike for a few days, then drift back to work. Gas company employees on strike in Manchester leave housewives with gas cookers facing the prospect of no hot meals over the weekend. The coal strikes in recent weeks have reached serious proportions. A series of strikes can't be condoned at such a time and isn't by any important body of opinion in Britain. But the fact that they do occur is one manifestation of invasion nerves. From a certain amount of knowledge of the British, I'd guess that when operations do begin, there'll be no strikes in this country. Invasion nerves are discernible in the government's methods of dealing with the problem. Government spokesmen have been inclined to blame it all on the sinister activities of a few hundred British Trotskyites. At present, there's a great hue and cry about them, for a day or two played up in the London papers on strictly thriller lines. A new defense regulation, drawn up with the consent of the trade unions, has been aimed at the Trotskyite agitators. Yet this is all a crude simplification, a surface attempt at dealing with a deep problem. The Trotskyites are undoubtedly guilty of doing as much as they can against the war effort. But their efforts would be unavailing if second front nerves and the fact that real grievances have been allowed by the government to trail along for years without settlement didn't create the conditions favorable to such unofficial strikes and stoppages. Invasion nerves have shown up even in royal quarters here. Only thus can be explained the statement I heard young King Peter of Yugoslavia make this week to the effect that all the aid the Allies had sent his people wouldn't suffice to equip even one battalion. I can't recollect any time in history in which a monarch cooked his own goose so quickly in a single sentence. Peter evidently meant only Mihailovich and his Serbs when he referred to my people. For thousands of tons of weapons and equipment have been sent to Marshal Tito. It was the first time in public, then, that the king proclaimed himself as only the king of Mihailovich's dwindling force instead of the king of all Yugoslavs. In fact, if you were betting on the future of the Yugoslav monarchy, something more than a good outside chance might be given to the possibility of a tie-up between Tito and the monarchy in the person of one of King Peter's younger brothers. But even though Britain can give examples of war nerves, constructive work is being done that will help international understanding and cooperation. I heard Representative Fulbright yesterday explain the work that the Allied Educational Reconstruction Group is doing. Mr. Fulbright believes that in the cooperation of bodies like UNRWA and his committee are being laid the foundations of political cooperation in the post-war years. The education group will rebuild the wreckage of education in the occupied countries, get classes going, provide teacher training, textbooks, paper, pencils, to make possible training for citizenship of children of our allies after they've been liberated. Such schemes are hopeful for cooperation possible in such varied types of activity as the Second Front, education, and yesterday's statement about international currency should point the way to cooperation in other fields after the war is over. On these War Telescope broadcasts, you usually hear men with some special knowledge discuss some particular phase of the war. Today I'm going to do something new. Introduce two of the men who'll be part of NBC's European invasion team. They've just arrived in London from New York and Washington And their first impressions of life in Britain at this crucial moment would perhaps be your impressions if you'd had the chance to make the trip. You'll hear both of these men many times in coming months. One you've heard often in the past year, broadcasting from New York. He is W. Chaplin, veteran foreign correspondent and author of the book 70,000 Miles of War. He's been to Russia, India, and Cairo, but this is the first time he's been to Britain since September 1939, the first month of the war. The voice of the second will be new to you. He's NBC's war correspondent accredited to the U.S. Navy, George Wheeler. He's been a broadcasting executive in Washington, and this is his first trip to Britain in wartime. Now, to begin, what do you fellows get as a first impression of Britain in these pre-Second Front days? What do you find that's different from September 39, Bill?
Well, of course, John, the most obvious difference is the number of Americans here. It's a little hard for me to realize even yet that this is England, because there are so many Americans here. That's the first impression I had, the first change, and next? Well, the next change I noticed was the result of the bombing, and that came to me only gradually. I got to London at night, during an alert, incidentally, and drove to a hotel through blacked-out streets, deserted except for people who have very special and very important duties at such times. Next morning, there seemed to be very few changes. The city as a whole is just the same. The barrage balloons still look like great gray snails climbing slowly up the wall of the sky. Enough of the old landmarks to give an impression of business as usual. It was quite suddenly that it came to me that big gaps in rows of buildings didn't indicate new construction, planned and prepared for by the intentional removal of old buildings. This was bomb damage, the debris neatly swept away. When I was here last, no bomb had yet fallen on London. As I've walked around the streets in the past couple of days, my eyes have already become educated. There are many changes in London.
Does that jibe with your impression, George?
Yes, it does, John. From just a quick look, you might get the impression that the bombing wasn't as severe as you'd supposed. But taking into account the ability to rebuild and repair, the surest indication of the beating that London has taken is the absence of window glass. Many, many blocks have their sightless eyes for reminders, whereas in other respects they may appear completely untouched.
Well, what do you think are the most outstanding characteristics of life in London at the moment?
Well, I've been struck by the contrast between the very old and the very new. Tradition existing beside advanced economic and sociological thinking. Fine old buildings beside modern architecture.
The thing that struck me first and hardest is the general feeling of calm confidence. It wasn't that way in 39. It wasn't that way at all. War had just been declared. No one knew what was going to happen in any next minute. But they were quite ready to believe it would be something awful. Children were being evacuated from the big cities. Everyone was carrying gas masks at all times. Even waiters in restaurants wore them, strapped on behind like a bustle while waiting on table. Well, it isn't like that now. After all, this home front has been a very active war front for a long time.
You mean people don't have to wonder about what sort of things may happen?
That's it, John. They've been through everything that can happen to a home front, and they know all the answers. So they just go on about their business, calmly, confidently, completely unafraid. To me, it's more than reassuring. It's really inspiring.
Do you think this British attitude has had its effect on our people here?
I think it must have had. Confidence and calm are just as contagious, just as catching as are hysteria, bewilderment, and the jitters of any kind. Certainly, even the little time I've been here has been long enough to show very plainly that our folks here aren't suffering from any kind of jitters. And I think the British attitude must have been a big help to them when they were getting settled in.
I've been noticing a lot of little things. For instance, I'm noticing the papers proposing a share-the-ride scheme for taxicabs. It's a little amusing, you know, because we've been doing that in many American cities for a long time. Mm-hmm. Another thing, rationing is much more complete here than at home. The ordinary man doesn't seem to be as affected by inflation as his counterpart in the States. As long as he keeps living an ordinary life, he's all right. It's when he wants to kick up his heels that he feels the pinch.
But even the ordinary man has to pay 50 cents a pack for his cigarettes, George. And I think you'll get a shock when you go to the movies and have to fork over a couple of dollars a seat. But, Bill, were conditions here any different from what you expected?
Yes, they were, John. I'd expected to see things generally changed a lot more than they are. I thought the people would be changed more by what they've gone through. I thought all the physical hardships, the war taxation, the rationing, all that sort of thing, I thought it would show more on the surface. Actually, it hardly shows at all on the surface.
What's your first impression of the American Army over here, Bill?
Well, of course, I really haven't had a chance to see much of it. Nothing of it in the field. But to judge just from what you can see in London, I'd say that our army here is an army ready to go. Certainly the morale is tops, and I'm told the degree, the perfection of training is just as high.
You came over with the Navy, George. What's that angle?
Well, I got a wonderful kick out of the way men who were once bankers and butchers and beer salesmen have pitched in with the regulars. As an American, it made me pretty proud to see the way they're doing the terrifically complicated business of running convoys and fighting ships.
Any incidents you remember in particular?
Well, I can't say much, of course, but there was one story that I think's worth telling. It was the story of a colored mess attendant. He used to spend all his spare time studying up on plane recognition, silhouettes, and that sort of thing. One of the officers heard about him and decided to give him a test. The final exam for experts consisted of identifying silhouettes shown on a screen in a darkened room for only a 50th of a second. This colored mess attendant quietly identified 100 out of 100. They set the machine to 100th of a second per flash. The mess attendant's average fell to 95 out of 100. Then, half apologetically, he proceeded to give the nationalities and general types of the remaining 5 planes. And now when the bosun's whistle sounds all hands to general quarters, that slight, shy steward's mate is not a mess attendant anymore. He's assistant to the gunnery officer for the whole ship.
Pretty good. He's a lucky man to have eyes like that. Speaking of ships, what do you hope to do covering the Navy in the invasion, George?
Well, I hope to get wherever and whatever there is of naval action and record it on the spot, John, at sea. I've been experimenting with the up-to-the-minute recording device. We hope to rush these recordings away and broadcast them home as quickly as is humanly possible.
What about your trip over here, Bill? Your first sight of Britain, an American air base, that sort of thing.
Well, John, I'm really not sure just how much I can say about things like that yet. You always have to find out the ground rules in each new theater. But certainly I can say that I came by air in one of the big planes of our Air Transport Command, and that it was a very nice trip. Not so much as a bump, all the way from Washington to the place we landed, somewhere in the United Kingdom. You asked about an American air base. The only one I've seen so far is that place we landed. And I guess all I can say about that is that it was impressive, very impressive. If everything over here is as smooth as that air base, and I understand it is, well, then I can understand why the German radio is having such a case of high-temperature invasion jitters as it is right now.
And I shouldn't be surprised if Nazi high temperature got higher still before it's over. Thank you, Bill Chaplin and George Wheeler. This is John McVeigh returning you to the NBC newsroom in New York.
And so ends another of NBC's War Telescope broadcasts, a regular weekly presentation from the NBC newsroom in New York. During today's program, you have heard John McVeigh, NBC's observer in London, presenting W. Chaplin and George Wheeler, NBC's newly arrived observers in London. This is the National Broadcasting Company.